Hello, and welcome to today's Bloomberg BNA webinar titled Privacy by Deletion, 5 Steps to Reducing Data Risk. I have just a couple of announcements before we begin. First of all, thank you for attending today's presentation. Questions will not be submitted by telephone. Questions may be submitted at any time via the Q&A pod at the lower right of your screen. Simply type your question and click the icon to the right to submit. Questions will be allowed to accumulate and will be addressed towards the end of the presentation. You will currently see instructions on how to earn credits for attending today's webinar. If you have any questions about continuing education credits, please email us at credits@bna.com. In order to obtain daily credits for attending today's presentation, you must answer all polling questions that are presented throughout the webinar. There is no submit button for multiple choice questions. If you would like to receive daily credit for attending today's presentation, please make sure to answer the polling question at the end of the program accurately, which will ask for the jurisdiction where you wish to receive credit and your corresponding bar number. Your certificates will be ready to download in your classroom at learning.bna.com in the My Certificates tab, generally within 1 business day of the presentation. A copy of the presentation you're about to see, as well as instructions for downloading your certificate, can be found in the Files pod to the right of your screen. We would like to thank FTI Consulting for sponsoring today's program. FTI Technology is a practice of FTI Consulting that is dedicated to helping organizations protect and enhance enterprise value in an increasingly complex legal, regulatory, and economic environment. FTI's clients rely on their software, services, and expertise for matters ranging from internal investigations to large-scale litigation with global e-discovery requirements. I would now like to turn the presentation over to Ms. Angela Navarro.
Thank you, and welcome to today's webcast, Privacy by Deletion, 5 Steps to Reducing Data Risk. In terms of today's agenda, after we meet our speakers, we'll start by reviewing the risks of over-retention of data. From there, we'll move to discussing each of the 5 steps to reduce data risk, understanding what actually exists within your data, focusing on the risks, leveraging lower-cost storage options, preparing a defensible disposition strategy, and finally, measuring ROI on all of these efforts. We'll conclude by answering questions submitted from you, our audience. Additionally, throughout the presentation, you'll notice several pop-up poll questions. We invite you to participate and answer those polls as they come through. Now, let's meet today's speakers. Anthony Diana is a litigation partner in the Records and eDiscovery and IP Information and Innovation groups at Reed Smith. He focuses his practice on commercial litigation, internal and regulatory investigations, electronic discovery and information governance, and data privacy and security. Anthony has counseled clients on policies designed to protect sensitive information and comply with various regulations throughout the world, and has also represented clients before courts to ensure adequate protections or to defend the protections that the clients have implemented. We are very pleased to have you with us today, Anthony. Thank you for joining us. Jim McGann is our second speaker today as the Vice President, Marketing and Business Development at Index Engines. Jim has extensive experience with e-discovery and information management in the Fortune 2000 sector. In recent years, he has worked for technology-based startups that provided financial services and information management solutions. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, Jim.
Thank you.
Finally, we have Jake Frazier, Senior Managing Director with FTI Technology. Jake leads FTI Technology's information governance and compliance practice. Jake focuses on assisting corporations and governmental organizations with IG and compliance initiatives, as well as the corresponding cost and risk. Welcome, Jake.
Thanks, Angela.
I would now like to turn the call over to Jake Frazier of FTI Technology.
Great, thanks. So we thought we'd kick things off with a poll question. We know we had a few hundred, I think almost 400 folks registered. And so if we could get some audience participation, that'd be great. And really the question is your organization, or if you're with a law firm or your clients, actively deleting data today? And we'll just leave it up for a couple more seconds. Great. So if we take a look at kind of where folks landed, this is something that's really interesting, and we've seen this as a steady trend in the question when we asked this question. It's been a question we've asked for years, and really kind of started out around 0. most folks kind of fell into the save everything trap. So it's really heartening to see that we're up to about 52% of folks that answered yes. And so as a follow-up question, on the next slide, if you did answer yes, what's the main driver for your data deletion program? And you can kind of select all that apply. We have, either industry regulations, the GDPR or the General Data Protection Regulation that's upcoming out of Europe, cost savings, or data breach prevention, or another reason. So we'll leave that up for a few more seconds. Also very heartening to see that people, the number 1 here was data breach prevention, and that really stems from the title of this webinar session, which is Privacy by Deletion, the concept that if something is deleted, then it can't be breached or stolen or leaked. So that's great to see. Great, if we could go on to the next slide. So, I think that the trend that we see in the questions bear this out, is that it used to, be viewed by, I think, a lot of corporate counsel and outside counsel that really the safest approach was to save everything. That was, if you think back to the late 2000s, mid 2000s, e-discovery sanctions cases were coming out, and so a lot of folks had the perhaps appropriate knee-jerk reaction that we need to save everything. However, now, as we saw in those questions, there really is a balancing act that needs to happen. I think a lot of folks are realizing that perhaps it's not the safest thing to save everything, and that over-retention or hoarding of information carries with it a lot of risk. And so it's a difficult balancing act, one that we'll walk through a lot today, but it's great to see that the polling questions have bore that out. Maybe I'll turn it over to Anthony to talk through the next couple slides.
Sure. So just to go over sort of what the risk landscape has been in data retention and data deletion over the past decade or so. There's been I think a lot of movement, I think, in terms of, as Jake said, and I think as what the poll said, is people are now starting to delete data. So I think there's a shift where a few years ago people were keeping everything. I think one of the things, a few drivers now are sort of changing that, besides obviously the data privacy stuff, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page. Litigation liability still tends to be a relatively large driver for some organizations in deleting data. Comes up often from sort of the board level when there's a big decision against the company, or there's a large settlement, and the issue becomes, why do we have to settle for this? It's because of this bad document. And then the good question to ask is, why do we have it? And the answer is often because we keep everything. So we have seen that litigation liability is a driver and still remains a driver in terms of cleaning up your data so you don't have those bad documents that hurt you. In litigation, I have had clients tell me, well, the in-house legal departments as well, sometimes those documents are helpful. I suspect if you really talk to any outside counsel and any trial attorney, they would say they would much rather defend an organization based on testimony that they have from people than documents that may be bad. So just keep that in mind. E-discovery costs is a potential driver. I think this has been less of a driver, in part because costs are coming down as it's become more commoditized. But one of the issues in e-discovery costs, particularly those who are sort of managing e-discovery costs for their organizations, because even when the cost of processing and hosting data is coming down and even review, the problem is when they get more and more data, even when they're implementing best practices to sort of drive down costs, the total volume is keeping those e-discovery costs steady. So instead of seeing the decrease that they were hoping, instead they're having the steady state. So one of the drivers, or at least one of the things that people are thinking of, is if I have less data, then my e-discovery costs will come down, and that's not a bad thing to use for ROI when you're thinking about engaging on a project where you're deleting things. Next slide. And this one goes, I think, directly to what we were just talking about and sort of the theme here, privacy by deletion. There are so many regulatory agencies right now who are focused on cybersecurity, data breach, data risk, whatever you want to call it, data management. We've seen a number of specific fines recently by FINRA and the SEC where they were particularly concerned about how people were managing customer data. So particularly on the financial services side, but I think the SEC is broader than that. When you collect customer data in particular, although I can imagine it happens for employees as well, but I think particularly for customer data, the regulators are really concerned about how that's being managed. So, before FINRA was coming forward with fines about regulatory retention requirements and phrasing it that way, now they're phrasing it as a cybersecurity issue because you're not managing customer information correctly. And that could be access controls, frankly, even knowing where your customer information is, as well as getting rid of it. One of the things that we're seeing, and this is a new trend, and the FTC has mentioned this as well, that they are looking carefully at why are you keeping customer data longer than you need to. So one of the factors that they consider, particularly in a data breach, if you're talking to the FTC, they will consider that as a major factor in assessing a fine, is do you have policies and practices in place to actually delete the customer information when it is no longer needed for the purpose it was collected? So we're seeing a lot of that in terms of the enforcement side. Not all of it published yet and in fines, but certainly the FTC has been very vocal about this, and these other regulators who've been speaking have been talking about the same thing, about making representations about what you're doing with the customer data, and then also having policies and procedures in place to get rid of it once that need is done. We expect that state regulators are going to be taking a much more active role in regulating cybersecurity controls at financial institutions and otherwise. We've already seen the New York regulators, both at the AG level, where they've, I think, and at the Department of Financial Services level. We're also seeing in some other states. Pennsylvania just opened up a new division in their AG department regarding, similar to the CFPB, as sort of a consumer protection agency as part of their Attorney General office, which again I suspect will be focused on these types of issues as well. So this is going to be an area of I think, increasing concern and driver of why people should be deleting things.
Yeah, so we're going to go into our third poll, and with these regulations, including things that we're seeing through EMEA, like the GDPR regulation and so on, how are customers prioritizing what data is being remediated? Are they focusing on email, messaging, backup tapes, file servers, legacy applications? Is there a focus here? Because we're seeing definitely a lot of customers kind of picking and choosing their battles, especially when you're dealing with significant volumes of content. And as suspected, as I think there's no shock here, email is kind of winning here. Backup tapes is up there. File servers, yep, pretty typical. Email obviously is where you're going to see a lot of this privacy, private, customer citizen data, personal data being applied. So that's obviously a large target, but obviously it's in file servers and in your backup tapes as well. I mean, Jake or Anthony, does this surprise you?
Not at all. I mean, I think we've seen, and again, I think this is consistent with what I was saying. That's where the litigation liability comes in and the discovery costs come in. But I think one of the things that people have recognized, and this is from the Sony breach and some of the other breaches, that it's not just personal information, but sensitive information that is being distributed within your organization by email is the thing that you don't want disclosed in a data breach. So it doesn't surprise me at all that email, and that's what I'm seeing with my clients.
Yep, completely agreed. And as we kind of walk through some of the market research and survey evidence that's out there that speaks to various kind of data pitfalls and outline some of the risks here, some of these figures are helpful internally too for the attendees at the organizations to try to quantify these risks, right? So it's a little bit difficult when trying to go, let's say, for funding or headcount or resources or really whatever kind of sponsorship you might be looking for a program to either accelerate it or bolster it or start one that might aim to do defensible disposal remediation. So sometimes these figures are helpful. So a couple of them, that are kind of interesting here. 56% of the information that's eligible to be destroyed can't be separated from legal holds. So that's 56% of the organization. The concept here really is if you take something like a physical backup tape that has, or a set of backup tapes that really is a backup of the entire network, the tape is kind of an all or nothing proposition if you're going to destroy it. And so even if you don't know what's on it, you don't know it's subject to legal hold or not, then you kind of end up keeping all of it. We'll talk about some best practices in a little bit, how you can remediate that still. But so that's the problem of kind of intermingling. 70% more information than necessary is retained, and it's really how legal holds are written. So often we have clients that will talk about how everything is on hold, and kind of in reality, and not trying to give legal advice or anything, but it's not that everything's on hold per se. Sometimes it is, but very rarely. It's that we just don't know what's on hold. Therefore, we have to write the hold criteria in such an overly broad way as to again be safe. We're seeing with the technology more and more as possible to really parse out and find just the relevant information that's subject to the hold, using all kinds of criteria like keywords and custodians, metadata, ownership, really a combination thereof. So that kind of draws I think the picture as to kind of why folks are in the situation they're in. We have clients that have hundreds of thousands of backup tapes, millions of backup tapes. If we just focus on backup tapes that go back really forever. So a few other stats on here. I think that are key is really this bottom right one that I wanted to focus on. 78% of important or kind of official electronically stored information can't be located and used when needed, and so this is really, I think, the pivot from the concept that it's safer to save everything. If you can't find it, that really begs the question of is that safer? And I think the answer is no, because then you have it, but you can't find it and can't produce it. And the court cases are sort of littered with this kind of analysis. But maybe kind of ask Jim or Anthony if there's anything on this slide or other sort of data pitfalls and metrics that might be important for the audience.
Yeah, I think, Jake, what we see is, that organizations have been built, for decades in preserving data, making copies of data through backup, maybe making copies into archive, making copies. But they haven't been architected. They've been architected really for data protection, and so no data is lost, but not architected to be able to find data and manage data to today's information management policies. And the security or data breaches that are occurring and some of these new regulations that are happening around privacy are going to force that change. And I think we're kind of entering a new information management change that's got to radically change that 78% number down to make it very quick and easy for organizations to find data, and for many reasons, not only security and legal discovery, but to harness intellectual property and so on.
Yeah, and I would echo that. I think one of the drivers that we're seeing now is a lot of senior management with particular type of data basically want to and it's particularly the private data, personal information, they want to mine that for revenue or better business practices. So, and I think one of the keys is you can't, mine the data for assets if you have too much and you can't find it. So I think that's an important consideration. The other thing I would say is the idea that 61% of the organizations do not regularly delete eligible ESI using standardized processes. It's clear that there's probably, a large percentage of them are lying. 39% are lying because I don't think any organization is regularly deleting all eligible ESI. I think that probably represents some organizations doing something like, having auto-delete on an email, but even there's often leakage because they allow people to create PSTs. So, I think it's starting, but that's not my experience. Then I suspect that most organizations are not really regularly deleting all eligible ESI that's subject to deletion using standardized processes. I would be shocked if that was the case.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to admit you're a data hoarder, right?
Yes. Unless we all admit it together.
The first step, right?
Yes, first step, admit that you are.
Yes.
So I think, we've really kind of outlined the problem. I think it's important for everyone to sort of understand the problem and how it might be measured or expressed. We've talked about how really I think the prevailing thought used to be, maybe we don't want to dispose of things. I think that's changed, right? So I think most organizations who have thought about this want to be able to defensively dispose of information. I think the challenge is operationally, and sometimes the misconceptions of how easy or difficult it is are really the key blockers. So what I thought we'd do is walk through really 5 steps in how we can try to reduce this risk and talk some practical best practices.
Yeah, and Jake, we partner with FTI. We at IndexEnd as a partner with you to provide technology to help solve these problems. And I think a lot of organizations get into the whole analysis paralysis of not knowing where to begin. And what we've seen that makes sense is to kind of handhold them through the process. And I know you're a believer in this, Jake, as well. Is really to start understanding what exists. And there's been the process of traditional data mapping. We're focused on technology that can really kind of profile content and classify it and find it according to its value in the organization. So we have customers that are looking to find data of value, old research, old client records, old contracts, and so on. So to find that dark data that's typically hidden there, which is anything that's over 2 years old is typically dark data. It kind of goes back into the ether of the networks, and no one can really find it. So to make it available. So we have one client that has old engineering documents that they're uncovering today that have significant value. And finding that age data, the redundant. So, as Anthony mentioned, people are hoarders. They're not really deleting content. There's presentations or there's spreadsheets out there. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of copies of the same thing. So just the redundancy and the age data and classifying data into those buckets. And I agree with you 100% when you say that customers have save everything policies. I mean, save everything is not a strategy. Save everything is lack of a strategy. So when you go in there and say, well, why are you saving, this content that no one's touched in more than 5 years, and there's about 100 copies of it? What's the value in saving that? So a lot of content, ages out and outlives its business value, putting that into a classification and so on, and then finding that sensitive data. And I think that's where the key focus is for data breaches and things like new regulations that are coming into play. Where are things like PSTs? Where's PII? Sensitive contracts, who's accessing them, where do they exist, should they be accessed by these individuals. So putting things into little classification buckets so you can kind of focus on certain areas and say instead of trying to manage 50 petabytes, you could be managing a few hundred terabytes here and there and within certain departments and determining what you need to keep for long-term preservation and what could be wiped out.
And just from a practical standpoint, because I always like to mention budget because it's always one of the bigger issues is how do I get the money to actually do something like this? I think you'll find that there is budget out there. It's just called different things. So understanding your data is going to be part of the cybersecurity budget. It's going to be part of the privacy impact. So there may be parts of your organization that are doing some of this work already. And adding on a few extra steps is not going to be that cross-prohibitive. So finding budget in those circumstances is critical. And we also see it often with mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures, where it's the same process. There's a need for you to understand the data because you're transferring the data and like. So take those opportunities to get budget to do this, because someone is probably doing something like it, but they may not be thinking about it as this is a good way for us to think about how we're going to delete data.
Yeah, and one thing to add to that, Anthony, just to kind of piggyback on the practical nature of this, there's a lot of folks that clients that believe this is impossible to do, and it stems from the fact that going back in time, it kind of was impossible, right? As the networks exploded, email exploded, and data growth. Some organizations report 60%. 40, in that range every year, and companies that's been growing and growing organically as well as through acquisition, have investigated this kind of thing and said, well, can I get a report that shows me, how old the data is, where do we have, PII across everything, right? And the answer has been no in the past for several reasons. One of which the technology, it took a little while for the technology to catch up with this data growth, with all the new regulations and so forth. But one thing that's important to do is take a fresh look, because what was impossible in the past may be possible now. I don't hand wave and make it sound like it's, really easy and push a button, that kind of thing. However, we do have clients where we use technology like index engines and others that can and can index and tell us what's on a backup date, can tell us, what's on network file shares, and give us great reports to slice and dice. And once you're armed with those facts, then it becomes to be able to, take the adjustable chunks, right, to be able to sort of understand your data. Once you get that visibility, a lot of good things happen. So, I would just challenge everyone to really take a fresh look at what's possible.
Yeah, and Jake, you might want to check your audio is coming in and out. But, what we've seen is a lot of the technology that organizations use to be able to classify and understand data and manage it has come from the e-discovery age, and those forensic tools were designed, I remember back in the day they were designed to do megabytes of data, then they went to gigabytes of data, and then every once in a while you see some terabytes of data. But if you're doing real enterprise class information management to support these regulations, you need petabyte class tools, because you're going to go into a network that's going to got 5, 10 petabytes beyond that of data. So I think there are technologies that have caught up with this. Obviously, index engines being one of them. But the stat here that's on Anthony's slide in the lower right, I just want to point out is, $4 million to manage 1 petabyte of data in the enterprise. I don't think organizations know when they say, well, let's just increase our storage capacity 40% this year because storage is cheap. I don't think they're looking at the total cost of ownership of that storage, and it's significant. And I'm not even sure those numbers account for the risk associated with keeping that data.
Agreed. We almost could view it as a governance sort of tax, right? When you have the risk that have tried to quantify this and actually show that for every record that is leaked, the average cost works out to be $30 or $30. Yes, definitely. Move on.
Yeah, Jake, I think we're having a little trouble with your audio in terms
of
hearing you clearly. That does sound better, though.
Okay. We'll keep trying. Anthony brought up a point. Can you hear me okay now, Angela?
Yes.
So Anthony brought up a point around budget, right? So this is one of the challenges that organizations face. There are a lot of competing objectives. But given that regulation, the General Data Protection Regulation, goes into effect in May of next year, as well as the constant data breach steady stream that we see in the news every day. Given this new awareness, there's often a new opportunity to try to attack this problem. But it's important to understand, especially if you're not in IT, to understand kind of what Jim was talking about, which is the cost of data, and work with IT partners to determine sort of what are their goals, what are their needs, how can they benefit from both defensible disposal as well as from understanding what information is really what information needs to be accessed very quickly. Here, very expensive storage, very fast. What information for, let's say, regulatory compliance reasons. And as we work here, there's enough things to start. And given that, I think the market shows that they, go up about 1 or 2% per year or flat, or declining. This is another way that by understanding what data is important, critical, and what data is less important from an access and speed and availability standpoint, but perhaps important from a compliance standpoint. And that's really where we drop down to the bottom. One of the things that IT has done here is several different methods to accommodate this team.
Yeah, and Jake, hey, I apologize for interrupting you, but it sounds like we are having trouble hearing you come through clearly. So we'll press pause on this technology and data by tier, and let's move over to Anthony to talk about the change in deletion risks with the amended FRCP. Anthony, can you go ahead?
Sure. So one of the things that's interesting, as you may be aware, the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure were amended recently, and they were designed to protect against the inadvertent deletion of legal hold data, and generally just the deletion of electronic data. So that was designed to do that, and there's different ways that they did it, both in terms of 26B1, where they specifically changed the criteria for what is discoverable, and narrowed it so it's much more narrow, which is helpful. It didn't go necessarily to preservation there, but the concept of proportionality is now embedded in what is discoverable, and I think we also see that in terms of 37E, which is where they provide the protection for deletion of data and not having spoliation, there's references to proportionality and preservation as well. So there is now, I think, additional protection. That was one of the drivers of people that people were afraid, particularly legal, of getting rid of any data was because of spoliation and the like. One of the good benefits of these amended rules was, and there was certainly that was the committee's intention, was to allow organizations to start deleting data as long as it's done defensibly, so they won't have this case-ending sanctions because in good faith they have standard procedures to delete data. That doesn't protect you necessarily from the bad actor who is purposely destroying data to keep it from coming up in a litigation, but the general practices that we're talking about, there is some additional protection. One of the things that I think is interesting, and I think particularly legal has to understand is, and this goes to Jake's point about not being able to find information, the new amendments protect where you delete data in the normal course and you don't have it anymore, so basically preservation side. It does not protect against sanctions where you can't find the data. And some of the big e-discovery cases that were out there that scared everybody, Qualcomm, Morgan Stanley, and the like, were all about not finding data. So they had data that was relevant to a case, but in the course of discovery, they didn't find it. It was disclosed after the fact, often after depositions and fact discovery is closed. And that's when they got sanctions, because the implication was not just negligence, but there was a purposeful or reckless attempt to actually find information that you needed to produce for your case. So one of the things that the federal rules now really goes towards is defensible deletion. Like, you're allowed to defensively delete it. If you do that, you can find the data better. You know where it is. That's really good from a legal perspective. The keep everything is probably more risky right now, because the more you have, the more you can't find responsive data, so that you have a chance of having case-ending sanctions or being tagged by a regulator because you weren't able to find and produce data that they're requesting.
Yeah, and so, I mean, I don't think anybody's going to disagree that, finding the needle in the haystack has been always very difficult. And, what e-discovery has taught us over the past decade is it's very expensive and very complex and very risky. So the goal is to reduce the size of the haystack, and start cleaning data up. There's decades of content that exists out on the network. And, the ideal environment is that you set up technology that can really find data that has outlived its business value or has no requirements for any long-term retention, and to purge that content. However, the reality is organizations are just not really doing that today. But I think some of these regulations are going to force that issue. It's really where IT organizations are really going to need to partner with the regulatory compliance folks in organizations to build these procedures. And in building these procedures, I know it's not difficult to do when you're looking at some of these policies that are required, looking at the what's required for retention, what's required for legal hold, and anything else that no one's accessing or no one's really using. Especially looking at ex-employee data, people that have left the organization. You may wipe out their laptop, but then they've got tons of data, tons of files out there on the network that sit there in language. So I think there's going to have to be a significant shift in how this information is managed to really make it a goal for data disposal and clean up content. And we find that organizations find that there's 40 to 60% of content out there could easily disappear tomorrow, and there'll be no implications from a day-to-day business operational point of view. So it is a significant volume of content that really can be purged. I think the next slide, Jake.
I was going to say this, Jim, just to pipe in. I think one of the things, it's not as difficult as you think. I think as we talked about, sort of analysis paralysis, when you're looking at a file server, for example, some people say, well, I got a petabyte of data. How can I possibly begin? Legal's not going to do it. I'm not going to index everything, just look at every document. So how would I even make a decision? One of the things that was put in the other slide is one of the easy ways you could do this is say, okay, let's just do it by, custodian, right? If you've terminated employees, are you keeping all the folders that they created or those that are associated with that particular person? And from a legal's perspective, it's helpful because we often use that as a metric for responsive data for litigation. So if I'm looking at a list, I can just throw it up against the legal hold list and say, okay, I want to get rid of 20 or 10,000 employees' old network shares or folders or whatever that are associated with these specific custodians. You throw it up and say, okay, the ones on legal hold we're going to keep, everything else we get rid of. And again, you have to work with records to make sure that they're comfortable that there's no records there. But it's not as daunting as I think people think. You may not clean up everything. You still may have data 20 years old and like, but at least you're starting and you start making progress. And then developing those policies that are standard so that every time an employee is terminated, you make active steps to get rid of their data subject to legal hold and records issues. So there is processes in place that could help you at least sort of stop the bleeding. And then I think you'll probably get a lot less pushback, frankly, because terminated employees aren't there to say, I need that data. So just culturally, it's a lot easier to tell people, oh, I'm getting rid of the guy who left data, as opposed to saying, I need to clean up your own folder. So just something to think about.
Yeah, and Jake, one of the interesting examples of a project that we just completed on the West Coast in a manufacturing company, they had 2 petabytes of data that they really had no idea what exists there. It's just a shared file server. So their initial guess was they had about 500 million files, was their guess on that server. So when we went in and profiled that data, there was over 11.5 billion files. So they were significantly off on their guess. And when they started looking at this, looking at ex-employee data, looking at content that had no business value, they were easily, visually they could look at it and classify content. They were able to reclaim over 700 terabytes of data and basically eliminate that storage cost of data that they could quickly find that had no value. So I think there's a lot of sense of being able to visualize what exists, which we help customers do. But it's really about the ROI too, because I think that helps IT organizations stay motivated and incented to do this. So maybe the next survey question here that we have is, have you been able to calculate a return on investment? Because I think that's really key, and I don't know, Jake, Anthony, are you seeing that in your customers that they need to attach ROI to these projects? Does that allow it to move forward much more quickly?
So this,
go ahead.
Just and again, let me know if you can't hear me. So what I've seen clients do, and this may be emerging as a little bit of a best practice, is really try to get to maybe not a really compelling ROI, but at least get to self-funding, a break even, right? So if it's going to take services, technology, headcount, resources, internal time, focus, those types of things, to kind of calculate that out, and then at least get to self-funding, and then have all the other risk reduction benefits be really the kind of bonus ROI on top.
Right.
Yeah, I would say, I think one of the challenges is that if it's too ROI focused, you'd sometimes lose credibility. One of the challenges is that, oftentimes these initiatives take time. There's always going to be challenges and hiccups along the way that you have to deal with. It could be, oh my God, there's just the new legal hold that just hit and you're about to get rid of something. So how are you going to deal with that? Or, from a technology standpoint, when you're dealing with technology, there's gaps in the technology or risks associated with the technology that you're using that you have to understand and you have to deal with and mitigate those risks. So I think one of the challenges about an ROI is you don't want to be too focused on it. I would say that legal tends not to be motivated by as much by ROI. I think they're much more motivated by risk. And I think, to Jake's point, if it can self-fund, that's great because budget's always a problem. So if IT can sort of say, look, if we do this, we're reclaiming this much storage, we have, we're going to decommission these systems, we don't have to pay these licenses, that's always good metrics to have so they can say, look, there is going to be cost savings associated with this, but the reality is as an organization, what you're really doing is managing enterprise risk. And managing enterprise risk is hard to calculate because it's hard to calculate that when there's a data breach and you lose 30% of your, market cap. You can't calculate that, right? You look at the Targets of the world or whatever. It wasn't the fines. It wasn't that. It was reputational risk associated with, being viewed as someone who doesn't manage customer information correctly. That's the driver. And I think, again, you can't put that as an ROI, but that's a benefit that I think every organization now sees, particularly at the board level. I think the boards are very sensitive to these issues. So having initiatives to say, we are going to be managing enterprise data risk in a much better way, and here's a plan. And it's going to take a while. I think it's always helpful to manage expectations for senior management and the board that these are not things that say, oh, I'm going to do this next quarter. Information governance and deletion, privacy by deletion, and everything we're talking about is an ongoing process. You don't just do it and then you forget about it. You can do it and get the big hit, but then you have to have the people, process, and technology to manage that risk going forward. And I think that's the challenge right now is making sure that when we're talking about ROI, it's helpful because it may get you the original budget, but really changing everyone's perspective on what do I need to manage enterprise data risk going forward is critical. And you're going to have to get lots of stakeholders. It's the businesses, and there's your records management folks, the IT. They're all going to have, frankly, different agendas as to why you want to do this. The CISO, I mean, they're all going to have different reasons why this is a good idea. So, the cost may be a driver for IT, but it may not be a driver for legal and your security folks. So, I think making sure that you have a comprehensive view of why this makes sense, budgeting for the big project to maybe get started, but then making sure there's always responsibility and, frankly, budget going forward to make sure that that enterprise data risk is part of the culture. And that could mean bringing in on full-time employees to help manage certain aspects of this.
Yeah, I agree. On the legal side, it's definitely hard to measure the ROI, but we found it very effective by, if you look at this slide here, of building these visual ROI charts in an organization to really get ownership and buy-in from the IT organization. Because I think we've struggled over the years, or our customers have struggled over the years to get that collaborative environment where IT, who manages the data center, doesn't interact as well with the business side or the stakeholders that own the data or own the policy. And I think that's the bridge that is coming down, that is being built right now. And IT organizations love to look at this, and as Jake mentioned, if they could pay for these projects, and kind of a what's in it for them too. There's some advantages by reducing data center space and reducing storage capacity, and being able to migrate data out to cloud, which is much less expensive in a more collaborative environment, for example. But these are some charts that we've put together with our customers, looking at, once you classify the data, looking at the breakdown by department, and some of the things we've seen IT organizations do to get customers or the business stakeholders a bit of ownership into the cost associated with managing petabytes and petabytes of data is implementing things like chargebacks. So you can say, here's the capacity by department, and saying, you know what, the legal team is using 28% of this server. We need to charge them this because so they understand the cost of doing business here. Or looking at things like abandoned data, as Jake mentioned, when ex-employees leave and no one owns, the owner is gone out of the organization, that's abandoned data that's sitting on the network. Where is that, and where is it located? And then also ROT analysis, looking at that redundant, obsolete, trivial content. So we've had customers that grow storage capacity year after year by 40%. And the cost of storage, as the previous chart said, can get upwards of $4 million a petabyte. So just continually growing it is just going to add to that cost. But if you can reduce, through ROT analysis and cleanup, storage capacity by 40 to 60%, you can just stop the the madness of just growing capacity and get those costs under control. So we found charts like this to be very effective within the IT organization to say, hey, you know what, this is not just a project for my legal or compliance stakeholders. This is something that I would really buy into because it's going to save me time and expense within my operating budget.
And I would say these types of charts are also really effective at the board level or senior management. Visualization is always helpful because, talking about these issues can be rather dry. If they see a picture like this, it just makes it a little bit more concrete because they're going to have to make the decision to move forward, to fund the project, whatever. So I think these types of metrics and charts and visualizations, this type of work, the visualization I think is critical because words on a page are hard to, or in a slide deck, don't resonate as much as a really good chart with metrics so that they can say it's real. You're not saying we need to get rid of data because of the legal risk associated. You can say, look at this ROT analysis. We're taking on all this risk and we don't need it. And it's measurable because we now have real metrics around the risk we're taking on because there's a ton of data here that we don't need. And I think even, the email audit one I love because accountability is key. Not just, and this goes to the point, not just let's do this one-time project, but going forward, shame is a great motivator. So when you tell legal that they're the major, violator here of some policy, and it could be, there's lots of different things. It could be, email. It could be number of PSTs. It could be anything. The volume of file shares. Frankly, even the impact. I've seen this been a motivator for legal when they're showed the impact of a legal hold on this project, maybe email. I don't think people understand the impact it has on a program goal of trying to get rid of stuff. Once they see the metrics, there's an incentive to say, maybe I should scope these holds better. Maybe I should start lifting the holds in a more rigorous way. So I think data is always good to help motivate people to do the right thing in terms of governing the data risk going forward. So it's just a matter of getting this data and now translating it into policies and process that really help govern the whole, your data, in essence.
And back to defensible deletion of the content, as we said earlier, what we always hear is we need to save everything. We have a policy to save everything. And you do this kind of audit or this classification on the data, and they think when you talk about defensible deletion, you're talking about deleting the CFO's spreadsheet he created last week. Whereas if you do this, you say, and they always come back and say, oh, that data, oh, we don't need that. So I think putting it into this visual and allowing people to really understand what it looks like and what we're talking about, it makes it more meaningful and easier to make decisions on.
Yeah, and I often tell legal when they're put in a situation where IT comes in and says, look, we want to defensively delete something. You should never say no. What you should say is, what information do I need that I can make a decision, even if it's a partial decision, and put the onus on IT if they're the ones coming, or the business, and say, I need this information, some of the information that Jim has on the slide. Like, if I'm going to get rid of email, I want more information about the email. If I have a file server that you want to decommission, I need more information. Give me an index or whatever. So then once you have that information, you can start making decisions. And then I think the flip side is when IT complains about legal, which they do all the time, or the business does, because legal is the one who's the impediment or saying no, my response to them is give them more information and start slicing and dicing it so that you can say, here's something that is really low risk. Are you willing to let us get rid of, the stuff that's rot, right? Or the video, or whatever it is that you think may be the easy call. And then once legal does that, you can start, moving up and saying, okay, what do we need to do to get rid of this section of data? Is there more information that you need? So that conversation is key whenever you're involved in these types of projects. Okay, so in terms of the summary slide, I think one of the things that I like to sort of discuss with people, particularly when we're talking about, deletion by privacy, I think is a great concept because it takes it out of records management. I think one of the problems in terms of focusing on data remediation, getting rid of data, all of that, is it becomes a records management project, and people sort of roll their eyes because it's records management. It's very dry. And I think when you're talking about any of these types of projects, records has a critical role in this. Obviously, if you're regulated, you could have lots of regulatory requirements about your data. So that is certainly a focus. But I think sometimes particularly when you're talking with senior management folks and you're trying to get them to understand this, you talking about risk management is a much better selling point. And frankly, that's what really people are thinking about. When they're talking about the high-level data breaches and the like, it's really about risk. And I've talked to senior management, compliance folks, general counsel, even the board. When you talk about managing risk instead of information governance or records management, but actually talking about data risk and how you're going to manage that, it's something that they can deal with because it's something they deal with every day. That's what those senior managers and those senior folks are very comfortable making decisions based on risk. Do I have this new product? Am I comfortable sending it out? Let me think about the risk associated, the cost. They understand that. Data, they tend to sort of get uncomfortable with because they don't understand what it means to say what a record is and how long I retain it. They can't get their mind around it. But when you start talking about this is the way we're going to manage the risk and how the enterprise going to manage that risk? And again, we talked about lots of risk. It's data privacy risk, it's cybersecurity risk, it's e-discovery risk, it's litigation risk. I mean, there's constant risk. Then you start having a conversation that they can understand, and then it becomes prioritization, right? You can't boil the ocean. You can say, okay, look, I've got all this data in my organization. Here's the risks that in terms of the type of data that we have and where the risks are. And then senior management is going to have to come up with a decision about where do we want to focus. I mean, we talked about, we saw on the slide before, email as a focus. That makes a lot of sense for most organizations because that's where the data risk is. For other organizations, though, it may not be email. It may be that the most risk associated with their data, for example, in a tech company, is their IP and software and source code, right? So if the IP is the most important aspect of your organization, you may want to focus your efforts on finding that IP within a file server and protecting it and moving it. So I think you just have to think about what is the risk associated with it and who are the right people. You have to have that cross-functional team make those decisions or help make those decisions. And I think that's one of the areas that will help guide you in terms of what to do next. And one of the areas right now, what Jake has mentioned this before, the GDPR in Europe is going to be a big driver of these types of projects because to implement GDPR is you have to know where your PII and SPII is, and you're going to have to data minimization, make sure you're not keeping it as long as you need to. And that is, in essence, privacy by deletion. You're going to have to start getting into data. So there's lots of decisions that need to be made, and I think gathering the information and really thinking about it as managing risk is the way to do this. And then I think the last thing I want to point out is you want decisions written down. So all of this, it could be in your policies and procedures where you say, going forward, this is the way we're going to govern data and make sure that everyone signs off on it, or it could be a big project and you want everything, but you have to document every decision. You have to have the audit trail. I've heard many a regulator say the same thing. They're looking for an audit trail. They're looking for, when you're making any decisions about implementing new technology or getting rid of data or decommissioning systems, they want to know that there's proper testing, a pilot, all these things that you need to do that IT often does, but legal should be involved to make sure they understand it because they're the ones who are going to have to defend it if you're going to a regulator, and then documenting every decision because decisions matter and people are less likely to question a well-thought-out decision that's documented as opposed to nobody knows why this was done. I don't know if Jake or Jim, you have anything else on this slide just in terms of process going forward?
Yeah, I think the best idea too is to get past that analysis paralysis and obviously all these everything Anthony mentioned. I agree 100%. But start somewhere. Start small. Start with a couple terabytes or 50 or 100 terabyte server, and start looking at the data and putting the teams in place that will look at the data. And I think one of the most critical things is getting the right team in place that can really make decisions and put policy in place. Look at the data, view it, make some decisions about it, and then present it to senior level management to get buy-in and say, look at what we did, and this is the advantages to the organization. The risk, obviously, is the number one thing, how we controlled and manage risk, how we control costs, and present it there, and you'll get buy-in that will allow you to expand these projects and really put together a true information management infrastructure in place.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you also to Anthony and Jake for sharing your thoughts with us today. We only have a few minutes now for questions submitted from our audience. Again, we invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A tool. If we are not able to get to your question in the time allotted, you may receive an email response. And so this first question is for Jim. Jim, are there any best practices for profiling network data?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned just before, I think starting small and putting together a process and the right team in place, and definitely getting buy-in. I mean, buy-in is critical, and we've had organizations that started with a 50 terabyte server, did a profile, looked at the data, and started developing policy and determining the disposition strategy and executing on that. and then looking at what is the benefit to the organization to manage risk and manage costs, and that got the highest level exposure within the organization, all the way up to the CXO level office, because it's with the current ransomware, with the current data breaches and so on, senior level management cares about that. So when they see what can occur and what's happened and what the benefits are on a small environment, and getting buy-in to expand it to a larger environment, it's definitely the way to go.
Thank you, Jim. And thank you again to our other speakers, Anthony Diana of Reed Smith, Jake Frazier of FTI, and of course, Jim McGann, who we just heard from now with Index Engines. We wish all of you a good rest of the day, and thank you for joining us.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. I hope that everyone found today's discussion to be helpful and insightful. You can register for future Bloomberg BNA webinars by accessing our store at www.bna.com/learning. You will currently see instructions on how to earn credits for attending today's webinar. Please go to learning.bna.com to retrieve your certificate. COE certificates may take 4 to 6 weeks to appear depending on the jurisdiction requested. If you have any questions about continuing education credits, please email us at credits@bna.com. Finally, I want to again thank FTI Consulting, our speakers, and all of you for your participation in today's webinar. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.